teenagers are very idealistic, and so they will very easily grasp the message that you can be the next Lionel Messi or you can be the next Ed Sheeran. And of course, there's only one person who will ever be that. I think it's the antidote to self-esteem is having a realistic understanding of yourself. Having young people not judge themselves by grades, but
Hello and welcome to another in our Human Givens Ask the Expert podcast series. I'm Julia Wellstead and today I'm joined by Richard Brook to discuss how to help teenagers flourish. Now, Richard is a lecturer in social work at the University of East Anglia, and there he teaches a postgraduate module for qualified social workers on working with adolescents. He has over 20 years of experience of working with children and families, young offenders, adolescents with emotional and behavioural difficulties, and parents. Richard is also a practising human givens therapist, and he tutors the one-day course working with troubled and troublesome teenagers for Human Givens College. Hello, Richard.
Hi, Julia. Good afternoon.
Hello. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just thought we've got actually quite a lot of questions today. Let me just see, at least a dozen. But I just thought we'd start. Perhaps you could tell me a bit about how you came across the Human Givens approach and how it kind of you incorporate it into your work.
Yeah, sure. It must have been more than 15 years ago when I was working in social services and was part of a multidisciplinary therapeutic group working with children and families who were subject to safeguarding proceedings, and various professionals from different agencies decided that we wanted to offer some therapeutic services to families rather than just assessment and intervention. And it was one of the colleagues in that group who recommended that I went on a course run by Joe Griffin, which was then, I think, called How to Do Effective Counselling.
Brilliant, yes.
I found it kind of life-changing. It was one of these courses that seemed to just kind of clarify a lot of thoughts that have been swimming around in the back of my mind for many years about many things that are wrong with the current state of affairs in counselling and therapy, and just brought some really clear, usable ideas to light, which, as he promised, were able to influence my practice the very next day. And so went on and did the entire course. And I found in so many different areas where I've worked since, in youth offending services, in fostering teams, in sort of community social work teams, there's always been a place for human givens thinking and human givens practices, even when not practicing as a straightforward therapist. So yeah, there are ideas that apply, I think, to wherever people are working with people. These ideas will help you to be more effective.
Yes, it's a very sort of universal, overarching idea and framework from which to work, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So today, obviously, we're talking about the teenage years specifically, and the first question here is: the transition period from childhood to adulthood comes with a whole slew of physical and emotional developmental changes, doesn't it? So, and of course, we've all been through that ourselves and know how excruciating that can be, and how it has lows, obviously, but also highs. And sometimes you can swing from one feeling to the other very quickly. And so the question here is, how can we support adolescents through this process?
Oh boy, start with the big questions then.
Yeah, let's
Julia,
just...
why don't you? Let's do that.
Just answer the whole thing.
I think part of the answer to that question you've kind of hinted at by saying we've all been through it, and I think firstly just remembering what adolescence is like, remembering that it is a transitional process, and actually understanding something about the nature of adolescence. It is such an all-encompassing transition, that change from child to adult that goes on in those principally teenage years is such a vast array of changes. I think the more we understand about what it is, what's precisely happening in brain, body, in mind, the more we're able to help our teenagers. And to be honest, these days there's no excuse for for really not being clued up. There's so much good popular psychology out there. I mean, I've got a book on my desk at the moment by Sarah Jane Blakemore, Inventing Ourselves, The Secret Life of the Teenage Brain. Eminent neuroscientist in the most plain and accessible language. And there are, a whole range of books.
Yes, I remember one. In fact, I've got it here on the shelf somewhere. Brainstorm, I think it's called. Dan Siegel.
Yeah.
That I really enjoyed for this, how the teenage brain seems to be quite, well, different or transitional, of course.
Yeah, my favourite title, I think, is by Tony Wolff, Get Out of My Life, but First Take Me and Alex into Town, which is, I guess, probably comes from something that was said to the author by one of his own teenage children.
Yes.
But it's a book that just explains in the most plain and readable of terms what's happening in the teenage mind and body that might lie behind some of the behaviours that we find difficult or frustrating. So the first thing, I think, is just to understand some of that process so we can empathise and we avoid making those ridiculous statements like act your age and it's about time you grew up. If we understand exactly what we mean by that, I think we'll be more effective. And I think allied to that, there's a need to help young people themselves to understand the process. I've worked with many teenagers who they've bewildered themselves by the things that they say and do and think. And just helping teenagers to understand what's going on in their own mind and body, the nature of this transition can be really kind of refreshing and empowering for them.
I'm also thinking it's quite good to let them know that they do have that the highs and lows are okay and are temporary. The lows, especially, obviously high. When you're feeling good, that's fine. But when you're feeling low, that it is temporary. Because obviously the more serious side to this, and we did a podcast on this last week with a mother whose teenage son went on to commit suicide. And obviously for him, the low phases, the difficulties were just too much for him. So it's a natural process, but sometimes it can just get too much.
Yeah, of course. And I think we have to understand that for teenagers, some of the fairly common kind of difficulties they will encounter, they'll be encountering them for the first time in their life. And just to be able to give them some confidence that, these things will pass and that this is all part of a transition is really essential. So help young people to understand themselves. Psychoeducation, I think, is the kind of buzzword that goes with that.
Yes.
I mean, one other thing I'd add to that, I'm talking a little bit about some of the authors that have inspired my practice. I've run lots of parenting courses over the years, and I think the authors who've inspired me most in that work are Adele Faber and Elaine Maslish, who've published a book called How to Talk So Teens Will Listen, and Listen So Teens Will Talk. And their advice is to speak to the adults. In any interaction with a teenager, there will be a child talking to you in very selfish, self-absorbed, childish ways, and lurking behind it, there will be the voice of an adult, be a kind of glimmer of maturity and competence. And Faber and Maslish very much want to encourage those of us working with teenagers to speak to the adult, to look to the more developed aspect of that personality, and to treat that person with respect and to expect a more kind of adult response. And often when we speak to the adult, it's the adult that speaks back to us, and we see a more kind of responsible, reasonable person in there that's beginning to emerge.
Yeah. Oh, I really like that idea. And of course, that's pertinent throughout a child's life, really, as, speak to them as a sentient human being rather than anything else. Yes, I like that. So we're rapidly covering the subsequent questions here, but I'll run through them anyway as people have asked them. Is there anything we can do to promote healthy teenage development? So I suppose, are there any specifics you would suggest?
Yes, and actually that's an interesting question, because the we in that question, I think, I don't know whether that question comes from a parent or from a professional working with teenagers. And I guess the answer might be subtly different depending on which angle you're coming from. I feel that if we're professionals working with teenagers, well, it's a big question. There's so many different answers to it. But I was just thinking of a time when I was putting together some training for foster carers, and I wanted to get some authentic material that had the voice of a teenager in it about how adults respond to them. And the place I went to on the internet was an organisation called the Pearson Awards. This is an organisation that allows young people in schools to nominate their teachers every year for special awards.
Ah, how
And the
interesting.
part of that website I was really interested in was the young people who've been in some kind of special education, young people who've been excluded from school, who've had difficulties. And I wanted to know what those young people said at a time in their life when they wanted to congratulate a teacher. And I found a real consistent pattern there. Young people saying, Mr. Johnson was the teacher who believed in me when other people had given up. Mrs. Jones was the teacher who kind of didn't kind of overreact when I messed up, who gave me a second chance. And it's that aspect of an adult who can sort of see beyond the immediate problem, to see the potential and kind of believe in a young person and convey to them that you believe in them. I think that's a really key strength for adults, for professionals working with teenagers.
Yeah. Listening to them and respecting what they're saying, hearing what they're saying.
Yeah, and even when they're feeling quite despondent, being the one who'll say, "No, come on, I honestly believe you can overcome this, and we can pick things up even when you've messed up." As parents, I think, just reflecting on the long experience I've had of working with parents in various different contexts who are finding their teenagers difficult. I think the most common piece of advice I've found myself giving to parents over the years is don't forget that you need to change as your children grow up. Often parents will tell me, it all went wrong when they got into their teenage years. And I ask them, what did you change about your parenting as your children grew? And they didn't change anything. They just continued using the techniques that had worked perfectly well when their children were 7, 8, 9 years old. And so just look at how you need to adapt your own style. And, I think for all of us, this is a negative answer to your question. This is something that I think we absolutely shouldn't do. We shouldn't label young people, and we shouldn't pathologize the difficulties they get into. I've worked with a great number of young people who've been really difficult to communicate with because they were very wedded to their diagnosis, very wedded to the label of dysfunction that someone else had attached to them. So once a young person is labelled as having anger issues or having an anxiety disorder or a personality disorder, that can be really embedded into their sense of identity.
Because it's almost like they've been given something. Here's this rock to carry.
Yeah, at a time in their life when the identity is really very ripe for forming and solidifying. And so actually offering a young person the opportunity to get rid of that personality disorder or to move beyond that anger problem isn't often particularly appealing because it has become part of their identity. So I'd say for all of us, parents and professionals, be very careful with labels because labels, they can be convenient ways of kind of categorizing difficulties and problems. They can be very useful for the adults, but for teenagers, I think they can be very harmful.
Yes, even such. I remember I came to your course a number of years ago, Richard, and I remember you saying that, and I thought at the time, even with labels that aren't perceived to be bad labels, like she's the musical one and she's the tomboy, it still pigeonholes kids at an age where they need that wide open vista of possibility. They don't need to be channeled like that.
Absolutely right. There's anything that closes down possibilities in young people's minds. Yeah, as you say, even if it's meant with the very best of intentions, can be seen as harmful.
Yeah. So moving on, why do young people have difficulties?
Oh, boy, I thought you'd asked me the big question already, so coming with an even bigger one.
I was thinking that's a nice short one.
Yeah, short but large. Well, let, let me reflect a bit on the workshops that I do with practitioners who work with teenagers. And I've been doing workshops in various settings for quite a number of years now. I can't quite figure out the number of people that I've asked this question to, but it will amount to several hundred, if not, thousands.
Yeah.
And I ask people just to reflect on their own experience of being a teenager, then to think about the teenagers that they currently work with, and say, are we making it easier or harder to be a teenager these days? And yeah, there's always a few dissenting voices who will say teenagers have got so much stuff. We provide so much more for teenagers. The world is more teenage friendly. We've got youth services, youth offending teams, youth counselling. But actually, the vast majority of voices in response to that question will, very spontaneously say, we've made it harder. We've created an environment in which it is very difficult to negotiate this transition. For all
in what sense could you encapsulate that?
Well, people probably turn first of all to the education system, that we've created a system where so much seems to ride now for young people on the successful outcome in their education, which to so many young people just seems to be so kind of meaningless. Sometimes with the best of intentions, we give people wonderful motivational messages about you can be anything, you can do anything you want with your life. I had a young person just a few weeks ago saying to me, Richard, they tell us this and it's rubbish. We can't be anything. We can't be anything we want to be. We apply for jobs and we don't get them. We knock on doors and they remain closed. And they've sold us this lie. And young people get very despondent. They get into a state of mind where one failure seems to be a lifelong setback. And I think we as a society have created a world where the pressure on young people is enormous and their capacity to deal with it is diminished.
And it's as if we've given them the end goal of you can do anything without the stepping stones to it, or it's too big, it's too non-specific, I suppose, as well. And that's where perfectionism comes in as well, doesn't it? It's sort of, you must get the A star or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've developed a system where we value one particular aspect of success, and young people who aren't capable of that degree of success feel they're kind of left behind, feel they don't have a value. So yeah, we seem to be living in a world that is increasingly stressful, increasingly difficult to meet our emotional needs, and teenagers are growing up into a world that doesn't seem to have the same kind of options open to them that it did maybe even 20 years ago. Yeah. So yeah, I tend to agree with people that we made it a tough and fairly toxic environment collectively for navigating adolescence.
Yes. So it's almost as if we said you can do anything, but being brilliant academically is the best thing to do, rather than speaking to all teenagers and saying you could all do anything. It's more knowing what the individuals are like and helping them to.
And I think we need to create an environment where it's okay to fail, where we don't put these unbearable pressures on our teenagers.
Yeah. And how can we educate teenagers about what they're going through? And
teenagers are very idealistic, and so they will very easily grasp the message that you can be the next Lionel Messi or you can be the next Ed Sheeran. And of course, there's only one person who will ever be that. I think it's the antidote to self-esteem is having a realistic understanding of yourself. Having young people not judge themselves by grades, but by having more kind of descriptive feedback of what they do. Where I work at the moment in university, there's a really concerning phenomenon about the feedback that staff give to young people on degree courses. Typically, young people will they will access whatever system they need to access in order to know what grade they received for any work they've done. But if they have to make any effort to come into the office and pick up their written feedback, there are envelopes just left lying around in pigeonholes. They don't want their feedback. They don't want that kind of descriptive account of what they did and how they did it and how they achieved that grade. They're just focused on the grade.
And that must be something that we've instigated then.
I think we've instilled that in young
Yes.
people, that the grade is everything. The effort is almost immaterial. And yeah, we scratch our heads in universities saying, how can we make our students actually be more interested in reading our feedback and knowing what we think about how they got to the grade that we've given them.
And have you come up with any answers for that?
Well, only to always make that feedback, very descriptive, to almost to enter into some kind of dialogue with the writer of an essay or the producer of a piece of work. Allows them to see that we've taken an interest in it rather than just to evaluate it.
Yeah. Teenagers often see themselves as adults and often as kids, as we've said before, but when if they want to see themselves as adults and be treated that way, how should we respond to that? And I think this is sort of what you were saying about parents changing as their child grows.
Yeah, and speaking to the adult, actually another one of my favorite authors is a guy called Thomas Phelan, and apologies, this is a bit of a classic text. Thomas Phelan is probably more well known for his book 1, 2, 3 Magic. That's a guide to sort of managing difficult behavior in small children, but he's written a book about, for parents particularly, about bringing up teenagers. And in there he has an absolutely classic piece of advice, which in all the parenting courses that I've run has probably been the most well received piece of advice that I've passed on to people. He talks about there being 4 different stages of authority that you occupy in any kind of interaction with a teenager. Observer is the first. If you imagine a ladder with 4 rungs, the bottom rung is observer. And at that stage, you just watch with curiosity and interest, but you don't intervene. You're just interested in what your young people are saying, thinking, doing. The next stage is advisor. That's the stage where you very gently intervene, and it might be, you might find it, more helpful if if you're in before midnight tonight. You might like to take a coat out with you if it's going to rain, but there's no insistence. The third stage of the ladder is negotiator. That's when there's a problem that needs to be solved and the parent insists that it must be, but they don't insist how. Yeah, your room needs to be tidy by the weekend. How's that going to be achieved?
Yes.
And the final stage of the ladder, the top rung, is director, where you say, look, this is going to happen. I'm taking the authority, my way or the highway. And, I'm in charge here. And the very simple and profound piece of advice that Thomas Phelan gives is that the older your children get, the lower down that ladder you have to spend most of your time. And actually, that's quite counterintuitive.
Yes, isn't it?
When teenagers are causing problems, we tend to go in high. We go in at director. We go in with all guns blazing, telling them how things are going to be. And actually, that's not speaking to the adult. Speaking to the adult is the approach that says, okay, I'm interested in how you're going about this. Let's see how this works. You might want a bit of advice. Actually, you want more than advice. You need me to guide you quite strongly here. And ultimately, you might need some direction. But what we do when we take that approach is we kind of coach young people in adult ways of solving problems. We let them see our working out.
Yes.
By, building to the big advice slowly rather than just kind of springing it on them.
Yes, and allowing them volition and the chance and the space to come to the right conclusions themselves.
Yeah. And even to come to a conclusion that we wouldn't have thought of. Sometimes teenagers really surprise us by having a better idea than
like
we
I'll set fire to my bedroom rather than clean it.
that could happen. We wouldn't necessarily approve.
Yes, but that's so interesting, isn't it? That because I was sitting here, I've actually jotted down observer, advisor, negotiator, director, and I was sort of feeling like it went the other way to what you then said, that you actually back off as they get older.
Yeah.
And become just an observer. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so we're just coaching young people to think and solve problems in a more adult way, rather than taking the responsibility away from them.
Yes. That's very interesting. Yes. Now, the harsher end of this is anxiety, depression, OCD, self-harm, addiction, all of these sort of mental health difficulties, which can and do impact teenagers. So how can we spot the signs of a troubled teenager, and how should we approach a teenager who we feel is troubled?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. And I mean, the answer is it's very difficult, I think, to spot the signs of some kind of psychiatric disorder. The standard answer, I guess, to a question like that is to look out for changes in mood and behavior. And of course, in that adolescent phase, changes in mood and behavior are very frequent for perfectly good and innocent reasons. So I don't think we can get away with just saying, look for unusual, unexpected changes in behavior. And I really, you can't give a flippant answer to this question, because this is the serious stuff you mentioned earlier. Young people who may have ended their lives in the process of being depressed. So that there is no easy and flippant answer to this. And I'm very, aware that any answer that I give to this might be seen as almost kind of blaming someone who didn't spot the signs, and that's the very last thing that I'd want to do.
Yes, but the very fact is that it's, as you've just said, it can be incredibly difficult to spot because things are so variable anyway.
Yeah, of course. Be attentive. Give young people space to talk. Adults who are involved with teenagers seem to take a default position of you need my advice. And actually, if we take the default position of you need a bit of space to talk things over, this might help. Faber and Maslish, again, you get back to my favourite authors, recommend that we acknowledge feelings. Sometimes young people will behave in a way that makes us want to deal with the behaviour. They've been rude, they've been confrontational, perhaps they're being upset, they're in distress. Rather than dealing with the behaviour, initially, Faber and Maslish say, acknowledge the feelings. Just let young people know that you've noticed that they've got some strong emotions going on. This helps them just to develop a language for their emotions. Young people have the richness of emotional experience that anyone, adult or child has, but they often don't have the language to express it. So just helping young people to develop that language for their emotions, to be able to talk about it, and therefore to be able to understand themselves a little better can really help.
Yes, I absolutely. I have 3 sons of my own. I think it can be very difficult for them to talk sometimes. And there's the classic thing of go for a walk or go for a drive, where things can come out that maybe don't come out within the household.
Absolutely. And, so many professionals working with teenagers also find that those informal ways of communicating are often way better than the formal, face-to-face counselling scenario. So, where it's safe, I've always favoured, taking young people out of the building and walking around a local park, or, just doing some activity that comes a good context for a conversation.
Yeah.
Rather than the counselling setting, which is really quite alien.
Yes, they don't really want to be face to face with and eye to eye with you, perhaps, but they'll chat whilst walking along.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, as a parent, it's sometimes hard to stay patient and not get frustrated, especially if that language, that communication isn't forthcoming. So how can parents have that patience and give that time? And I think actually I would say time is of the essence here to help their children get back on track.
Yeah. Now, no offence to the person who submitted that question, but that terminology, getting children back on track, I think can sometimes be problematic. parents will have an idea about what being back on track actually looks like, which might not be the way their teenager sees it.
Yes, very, very interesting. Yes,
And I
yes.
think, as someone who's worked with teenagers and parented a couple, I think you have to accept that the track they end up on might be very different from the track you
Yes.
imagine for them.
As I said earlier about the musician and the tomboy, yes, who probably would rather be doing the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah, but taking that question in its its best intent, we do want young people to be in an emotionally healthy state and capable and competent and managing their lives. And I guess if that's what we mean by back on track, then let's take that. Sometimes the adolescent years, I mean, it's been described as storm and stress. I can't quite remember the author who coined that phrase, but it's a very well used one. And adolescent years can be storm and stress. They don't have to be, but often they are. And having worked in social services, in safeguarding team, in fostering teams, I've been involved with families that have really encountered the most horrendous of storms in the teenage years, the conflicts, the sort of rebellious behaviour, parents just being unable to cope. And taking the idea of a storm, I've sometimes used the metaphor of the house you might live in if you lived in a hurricane zone, a place where physical storms were common. You'd live in a house that had strong points and weak points. It would be designed to have windows, dividing walls, maybe even a roof that could easily be blown away. And when that happened, it would look like absolute devastation. But your house would also have strong points. It would have a superstructure that's built to allow the wind to blow through it and to remain firm. So when the storm passes, the thing can be rebuilt. And I've often
the structure is still there.
Look, if you can just hold on to the strong points in this relationship, if you can keep your communication open, if you can resist absolutely giving up on this young person, if you can maintain something of your relationship through this storm, it will pass, and what's left can be rebuilt. Your adult relationship with this young person needn't be harmed because of the stresses and the storms that they go through as adolescents, and that can be an encouraging message. Not to minimise the difficulties that some families find themselves going through, but to know that it can pass.
And also to communicate to your child that you're there for them, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely, and that can be so difficult for parents when what's been said and done they can take so personally. They can this desire that young people go through as teenagers to be independent, to break away from parental authority and control. Lots of things can be said that are really quite personal, and so just helping parents to let some of that go, to see it for what it is.
Because of course parents are, sorry to interrupt, parents are under a lot of stress themselves, probably work, money, keeping everything together. So sometimes having the time and space to just give to your child can seem quite difficult to find. Of
course, yeah, bringing up the teenager is for most people not the only thing that they've got going on in their life. You're absolutely right. But yeah, I was going to just recount a story of a foster carer actually who came in to see me in the office one morning and said to me, "Richard, I'm glad when you did some training with us recently that you told us that to not take things personally, that everything teenagers do, they do for a reason, but it's probably not personal." And I said, "Why, what's happened?" And she said, "We had an argument this morning about going to school. The teenager did go to school, but she said, when I went up into the bedroom, I just saw 'I hate you' written in blood on the bedroom wall."
Oh my goodness.
And she said, "I remembered what you said about not taking it personally, but I thought I ought to come down and just talk this over with you and make sure I'm on the right lines." That kind of thing is a challenge.
Yeah.
to not take personally. But
Yes,
to
yes,
give that person
absolutely.
credit,
Being hated, yes.
yeah,
It's,
that young person's bags were not packed when they got in from school, and that storm was weathered. All credit to that person for having the mettle to
the
get
nerve, yes,
yeah.
to hold it, yes, hold your nerve, yes, yes. So we've spoken about this a lot, Richard, but what are those key communication skills we need to communicate with teenagers, and how does that differ from working with children?
Yeah, actually, I might not be the best person to answer that second part of the question. I've been all my career almost kind of avoided working with very small children. I found that I prefer working with teenagers, and you know, I think communication skills that we use in any kind of interpersonal work are kind of universal. The obvious thing to say is listening and such like. But I think with teenagers, for me, the key thing is building rapport. I think possibly children and certainly adults will be much more forgiving of someone who didn't work too hard at building rapport. They'll understand the rules of the game and they'll understand that you're there to help. But in my experience, teenagers will not forgive you very easily if you fail to build rapport. And very often, they didn't ask to come and see you in the first place. Whatever intervention it is that's going on wasn't their idea. It was some adult who proposed it. So they've got no vested interest really in building rapport with you. And sometimes the knack is to just give as long as it takes to open up that channel of communication and to create a trusting relationship with you. It's kind of pointless otherwise. So I think that's where we need to really sort of hone our skills.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I'm itching to quote my favorite quote by George Bernard Shaw, which is the biggest problem with communication is the assumption that it's taken place.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
of course, you think you've told them something, or they've told you something, but just check that it's clear.
Yeah. You see, when we go on human givens training courses, we're taught about matching and leading, which in many interactions is a really simple process. It's to do with posture, body language, you're reflecting another person's language. With teenagers, I think that matching and leading can be really quite complex. I'll give you one example of a young person who I was required to interview about a criminal offence that he'd been accused of. I had to write a court report, so I had to get some interaction going with this young person, some explanation about what had happened. He took a very different view. He was sitting there with his arms folded in a children's home, sitting at the opposite end of a very large lounge area. He's sitting there with his arms folded and his head down, refusing to speak to me. So what can I do? Well, I sat there with my arms folded and my head down, not inviting him to speak to me. We both got quite bored of this after 10 minutes. So I just lifted up my head and I said to him, do you know how to make a paper aeroplane? And he looked at me with utter contempt, as if I thought to say, of course I do. So I kind of offered him the challenge. I walked over, gave him a piece of paper, went back to my chair and started making a paper aeroplane with a piece of paper of my own. When I'd finished it, I threw mine at him. He threw his at me. We both picked them up and threw them back, and we had a few little exchanges of paper aeroplanes. After a few exchanges, I unrolled mine and just wrote on it "bored?" and threw it back to him. He unfurled it and wrote "yes," and back it came. And that was the beginning of our conversation. We never uttered a word in the hour-long interview, but by the end of it, both of our paper aeroplanes were well furnished with questions and answers. And we had a conversation. And we'd agreed to meet in a few days' time and talk in a more conventional way. We did. Now, I'm not giving that as a recommendation for a rapport building technique,
but that is
brilliant. That's needed.
Yes.
Yeah, but sometimes you just need to think on your feet and
yeah,
the way that we'll build rapport with that individual at that particular moment.
It actually reminds me of a very different situation, obviously, but we used to have a table tennis table out in the shed. And that was also a very good place to have a conversation, because you're literally batting back and forth, and they became very quickly much better than me, so they could smash me if
Yeah.
they didn't want to answer the question. They just go wham.
Well, you're right. Any game that has an element of exchange is a metaphor for a conversation.
Yeah.
So it becomes a really nice context. And
Yes.
yeah, the most common thing actually that I've done is just sit there and draw a noughts and crosses grid on a piece of paper and pass it to the young person who just can't resist drawing a cross in the middle box.
You can't not do it. That's brilliant.
Then we got a game going and we got some interaction, and sometimes the conversation builds from there.
Lovely. That's lovely. Now, how can we set goals for teenagers without them feeling instructed or controlled? And I'm just going to join that with the next question, which is, what should we do when those goals are missed?
Okay, well, that first question, how can we set goals without teenagers feeling instructed or controlled? Simple answer, we can't. If we set goals for teenagers, then we are by definition controlling and instructing them. We're telling them what they must want. When we work with teenagers, we just have to get over ourselves and allow them to have their own goals.
Set their own goals, of course. Have volition over that.
Absolutely. Now, I mean, that isn't necessarily a straightforward matter. I think, in my career, in working with teenagers, particularly, I have to say, in the 8 years I spent in a youth offending team, if I had kept account of what young people said when I asked them, what are your goals in life? The two most common answers to that question are drug dealer and porn star.
Right.
Neither of which I could really consent to or put on the official youth justice board.
Or encourage, yes.
Or encourage young people to work towards. So that's the opening hand for a negotiation, isn't it? We need to say, so, drug dealing, what particularly appeals to you about that? What skills do you have? How do you see yourself, making money, being an entrepreneur? So goals have to be negotiated, but they just can't be imposed. We have to start from where that person is at. And often, when you hear goals like that, your heart sinks, because this is a young person who has actually got so little ambition, so little sense of their own capability, and you just want young people to be able to see themselves in a more positive light. And so this whole process of goal setting is an integral part of our, working with young people to just raise their opinion of themselves and to see them capable.
Yeah, so really, before you even mention goals, it's sort of building, helping them to see their own potential and their own resources, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, everyone's different. Some teenagers will have very clearly articulated goals, and they'll be able to recite them, and they'll be very positive. So, it's not universal, but you do often find that, goals are problematic and need to be negotiated. The second part of your question was, what do we do when goals are missed? Which, of course, they are. And we've talked already about the kind of idealism that you often see in teenagers, that they want to aim high, and if somebody says they want to be the next Lionel Messi, they want to, as I once very foolishly said in Ireland, want to be the captain of England, want to be some sporting superstar. Let's not dismiss those goals. I mean, who knows? They may. It's more likely that in failing to achieve those goals, they'll achieve something worthwhile. So I think you have to have this balance between, not dismissing young people's idealism and yet still being realistic about themselves.
Yeah.
And when a goal is missed, when an exam is failed, or a job application is refused, or there's some kind of setback, I think we just need to model that art of staying calm and getting up and dusting yourself down and carrying on. Just helping young people to get that motivation to be resilient.
Yes, and it occurs to me, actually, I listen to a lot of radio, and so many people, when interviewed, these are sort of famous people by this stage, otherwise they wouldn't be being interviewed probably. They say, well, I set off to do this in life, but that didn't work out, or along that path I discovered this other thing. And so, you know, they've had a zigzag start. For very, very few people is it just a straightforward route to stardom or fame or richness or whatever it is they're after. There have always been some false starts.
Of course, and I think that personal stories of that sort are really helpful. During the time when I was working in a young people's a CAM service, a adolescent mental health service, one of my senior colleagues confided in me one day that he'd been excluded from 5 schools in his teenage years before going on to, you know, have a perfectly successful career.
There we go.
I probably wish he'd never told me this, because I used to use that story quite
Yes.
often with the young people that I worked with in the service. So that information probably went a little wider than he'd intended. But just being able to point to, you know, real tangible examples of.
Yes, the classic is Mr. Dyson made however many Hoovers that didn't work.
Yeah.
Vacuums, I should
Mr.
say.
Dyson,
Hoover being another person.
Hoovers.
Yes, that's right.
Mr. Hoover never made a Dyson, did
he? That's right. And Mr. Fleming, who found penicillin by complete accident. You know, there's lots of examples of.
Yeah, and these can be inspiring if they're just told in the right way at the right time. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So we were sort of alluded to how to help teenagers see their potential, but how can we also help teenagers who have troubles to find a solution? And in my mind, those two things actually also go together, in that finding your potential can at least dim your troubles, send them out of focus.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I teach on my workshop is the art of descriptive praise, which is, again, such a simple idea, but it's a little bit counterintuitive. You'll often hear parents and teachers and others who work with teenagers and with children telling them how great they are in very vague terms. You know, that's fantastic. You know, you've got loads of potential. You're really gifted. The art is to convert that into a really clear description. So, you know, if I'm working with a young person in a youth offending team, they turned up on time, I'll give them that feedback and say, really pleased that you turned up on time today. You know, I wonder if you're starting to get a little more organized. So I'll give them the label. Maybe you're starting to get a little more organized, but I'll give them the reason, the description that says why I've used that word. And young people who find it hard to receive praise actually find it very difficult to dodge that kind of praise, because they can't deny that they were there on time. If you've asked them some difficult questions and they've given a thoughtful answer, they can't deny that that's the case if you pointed it out. But if you just say, no, you're really bright and insightful, they can deny that, you know, as long as you like. So giving them praise that they can't dodge is one of the techniques that I found really helpful.
Yes, very interesting. So specific and concrete and irrefutable.
Absolutely, yeah. And praise that, you know, it kind of becomes a mirror that young people can see themselves in, and they'll say, yeah, I did do that. And even if it was entirely by accident, even if this young person, you know, never intended to be on time, they lost track of the time and were punctual by accident, still tell them what they did and still give them credit for it in that descriptive way.
Do you ever find, it just sort of makes me wonder, do you ever find that there's a sort of street cred element? So if you tell them, wow, you've come on time, one day they actually make a point of being late the next time because it's uncool to be on time. Is there a thing there?
Oh, there certainly can be. And I think with anything like that, you've got to be so careful not to overdo the enthusiasm in your praise. Another one of my favorite authors is Bill O'Hanlon, the solution-focused therapist. He's written an article about working with reluctant clients, particularly with reluctant teenagers. And he says, I have a motto when working with people who didn't want to come and see me, which is never be the most motivated person in the room, which is an enormous challenge, isn't it?
Yes.
How can you be less motivated than the teenager who didn't want to come? But I think we sometimes make the mistake of thinking that our enthusiasm will be infectious. It won't.
But
It'll just be irritating.
exactly. And going back to the first principles of the human givens approach, we need to match before we can pace.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I've seen so many people kind of get that wrong and think that the way to win a teenager over is to be incredibly positive and animated and enthusiastic. And I see eyes glaze over and hoods come down and, you know, hats get pulled forward.
Of course, because I mean, that's probably what their parents are doing as well, sort of bouncing around the kitchen, being over enthusiastic about things.
Yeah.
Yes. Richard, do you have a time that you could give as an example when you've put all this into practice to help a troubled teenager?
Yes. What example to choose?
Yes, I'm sure you have a wealth of them.
You know, one thing that really sticks in my mind is, you know, I mentioned earlier psychoeducation. If we can help young people to understand what's going on in their lives and to, you know, just to understand their own psychology, we can help them to generate solutions. I remember a young person, I'll call him Darren for the purposes of this description, who was in a very conflicted relationship with his mum. There was a lot of violence. There was a lot of, you know, heated arguments. There were holes in walls and doors that had been, you know, made by fists. It wasn't a happy household. And I went to see Darren one day, and he said, Richard, I think I'm going mad. You know, I think I'm having a breakdown. What's happened? He said, well, I came in from school and my mum just shouted from the kitchen, put your shoes away. So I just picked up this vase off a table, chucked it at the wall, slammed the door, went off down the street in my socks, just left my shoes where they were. Got to the corner and I thought, I'm going mad. And he was really genuinely upset and concerned about himself. So we talked about the fight-flight reflex. And we actually wondered, you know, if his mum had been coming at him out of the kitchen with a carving knife and murder in her eyes, what would have been the most sensible thing that his brain could have intuited that he did in that situation? And actually, it was pretty much what he did do. You know, the vase thrown against the wall is a brilliant distraction. The door slammed is a barrier, and then getting off down the road without any thought to whether your feet hurt or not would be the perfect kind of survival technique without any thought. And of course, thought has no part in the fight-flight reflex. It's an intuitive response. And once we kind of mulled that over a little bit, and he could see that there actually was some real method in that madness. There was some purpose to that behavior. Okay, there was no murder in his mother's eyes. There was no threat to his survival. And we began to work then on, you know, what might have triggered that inappropriate response. What was it in his brain that gave him that signal to fly into that rage? And that opened the door to being able to do some work on traumatic memories and look at the patterns that he was working with. But it just seems to be a good example of how helping someone to understand their own psychology can help to calm them down and just open the way to a possible solution.
Yes, that psychoeducation, as we call it, it is so brilliant, isn't it? I've had that in my own practice so many times, that just learning about that fight-flight reflex and the survival system can really help people understand what's going on. But in fact, the biggest thing I heard was that he came to you. It had shocked him.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. And that only occurs when you've got a reasonable sort of rapport with.
You'd built the rapport. Yeah.
And actually, I mean, a second angle to that question is to think about the many times when the help is given secondhand via parents. Very often with teenagers, the way to help them is to help their parents to see things differently. And I remember an occasion I was talking to a parent in a very similar situation with a young lad who I never met him actually. I only ever worked with a parent. The lad was out when we
that's interesting.
Meetings. But I heard a description of an absolute rebel who would, you know, just disregard and disobey everything that his mum told him to do. So he was being kicked out of school, he was getting in fights, he was drinking, taking drugs, hanging around with, in his mum's eye, all the wrong people. And she was just protesting that he was out of her control. And I just got a sense that they'd gotten themselves into a pattern here where there wasn't any real challenge to his behaviour. So I kind of stopped her halfway through her account and I said, I'm really impressed listening to you. You're telling this, how obedient your child is to you. And she said, what do you mean? Have you not listened to a word I've said? He doesn't do anything I ask him. I said, no, I realise he doesn't do anything you ask, but he seems to do everything you expect. And she kind of went quiet at that and mulled it over. And she said, really, do you think I'm somehow giving him permission? I said, it sounds like you might be. And so we just started to work on how she can speak to her child in a way that conveys better expectations. Because it seemed that every time she tells him not to go and get drunk, what he hears is, I expect you to get drunk. When she tells him to not get thrown out of school, he hears, I expect you to get thrown out of school, and would do exactly that. And that was the turning point for that mum, just realising that a subtle change in the way she spoke to her son might have an impact on his behaviour, and it did.
And of course, that's a wonderful example of the reframe, which we also use very often in the Human Givens approach. Of
course, yeah.
And once having seen that different way of looking at things, the mother, that she could never unsee that again. That
absolutely,
was a light bulb moment for her.
Yeah, and I think when you get those light bulb moments, that's kind of an example of the power of the sort of hypnotic suggestion. Because I think if that's delivered with a kind of a sense of shock at the right time and in the right way, it does become quite a powerful intervention in itself. And sometimes that's all that's needed.
Yes, that's brilliant. So Richard, what I've been hearing this whole time we've been chatting is that the Human Givens approach has really helped you in your work. We've touched on it throughout and mentioned. Is there anything else you want to say about that? And has it helped with different types of people, maybe antisocial behaviour, or anything we haven't covered in all these questions?
Wow, yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that I guess in the last few years, I've been coming at this from a more kind of academic perspective since I moved to working in a university. And I'm aware that there's a massive body of research behind the idea of strength-based practice, particularly with teenagers. If you can view the teenagers you work with as not at risk, but at promise, and you work with them in that kind of strengths-focused way, whether or not you're working from a strictly Human Givens perspective, there's a great body of research that says that this is the most effective way to help teenagers, not to focus on their deficits and difficulties, but to focus on their promise and their potential. And the Human Givens gives you a perfect framework for doing that. Working with teenagers, it gives you some actual physical resources, the basic idea about human needs and the guidance systems that we have to meet those needs can quite easily be written down on pieces of card and cut up and moved around and turned into something resembling a mixing desk with faders and goodness knows whatever. And so can be made into a beautiful interactive resource that right from the beginning of a conversation puts the young person in the driving seat in talking about their own life and how they meet their needs. So it's a method that really, it lends itself to creative approaches which teenagers often need.
Lovely. And what I'm hearing there as well is that you're using metaphors according to what that person is interested in. So you've obviously got to know them enough to figure out that they're interested with music mixing boards or football or whatever the thing is.
Yeah, and the great thing about metaphors is if you get a blank look, you've
try another one.
You've hit a dud one, and you go again and try something else, and there will be something that kind of brings a little light in the eyes that
clicks.
People recognise and respond to.
Yes. Oh, fabulous, Richard. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add just before I wrap up the podcast?
Wow, no, I don't think so, really.
I think we've had a pretty
we've covered
thorough
a good range
chat.
there, haven't we?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and many, many years of experience. Now, there is a lot more you can say, but not within this podcast. And I know you do give the Human Givens course. So just for listeners, if you would like to explore this subject further, Richard is hosting his Troubled and Troublesome Teenagers course, which is a one-day CPD workshop. It's in London. It's on Thursday, the 14th of November. If you'd like to attend, you can book your place on our website, which is humangivens.com/college, or call our office 01323 811 690. Now, all of that will be on this podcast page. I should say the workshop can also be held as an in-house training. So if you're unable to make it on that particular date, 14th of November, or in fact you feel that your team or business or university would benefit from the training course, please do get in touch with us. And as I said before, links for everything I've mentioned will be added to the podcast page. We really hope you found this podcast interesting and helpful. I certainly have. Thank you, Richard. And thank you to everybody for listening. I should also add, if you want to, you're very welcome to share it with anyone else who you think would benefit from listening to it. So until next time, bye for now.